They say that when you're starting a new business, and especially if you're a startup, you should look for the white space, be first to market, to go where your competitors are not. There is another option. You can do the exact opposite of that. In 2009, starting here in Toronto with a handful of people, we picked a fight against the largest e-commerce company in the world, with the most successful hardware manufacturer in the world, with the world's largest book chain, and with the most profitable search engine in history. It was a real David and Goliath and Goliath and Goliath and Goliath story. 7 years later, with 27 million users in 20 countries, with millions of devices, with tens of millions of ebooks, and a $315 million acquisition later, I get to tell you why that worked, why being Canadian mattered, and why sometimes the best revolutions don't look like revolutions at all. Kobo was born to disrupt. More than that, it was an exercise in self-disruption. In 2009, we were incubated inside Indigo and asked to answer a very particular strategic question. What happens if many of the Canadians who buy and read print today start reading digitally? Kindle had just launched in the US, Sony had brought e-readers out into the market, the iPhone was just being launched, and change was coming. The only question was somebody going to do it to us, or were we going to do it to ourselves? We chose option B. In a moment of truly strategic bravery, Indigo funded an organization to disrupt itself, and we spun Kobo out as a separate company with a specific mandate to turn people into digital readers. And that's exactly what we did. Today, 1 in 5 books sold in Canada is an ebook. In some categories, it's 1 in 3. In some categories, it's even higher. And Kobo is, when last I checked, the largest retailer of ebooks in Canada, one of the largest in the world, the second largest manufacturer of e-reading devices globally. It turns out we did 3 things right. The first was thanks to an especially potent mix of bravery and realism. We could tell that building a great e-reading service was going to be a big, capital-intensive project, and that not only was Canada not big enough to sustain the level of investment that would be required to compete with Amazon or Apple or Google, there was almost no country individually that was big enough to sustain that level of investment. We literally had to go big because we couldn't stay home. We were leaving an era where each country had its own dominant book retailer or two. We were entering a new era where only a few global players had the scale to be able to compete. The good news was that it meant that the challenge that Indigo was facing, protecting their customers from a digital onslaught, was a challenge that every retailer who sold books around the world was also going to face. And so from the very beginning, we set out to be one of those global players. We built systems on the assumption that we would be international. We hired people who were experts in markets other than our own. Even when we were tiny and global. The second thing we did right, counterintuitively, was to let go of the gravitational pull of the United States. In our first couple of years, we could see already that the US, the richest ebook market in the world, the richest book market in the world, was about to become a battlefield. It was the home market, the home turf of Amazon, Apple, Google, and Barnes & Noble, and everyone wants to win when you're at home. So while our competitors were all engaged in a very expensive fight to control the US market, we quickly and quietly expanded into every other single country that looked like a candidate for digital growth. Places where we could get in early, where we could start building brand and market share, and we gained months, sometimes years, of lead time and breathing room as competitors later struggled to internationalize systems that had been built to serve the US only. As those markets have grown, we've been able to grow along with it. And so now we find ourselves with the majority of our revenue coming from outside of Canada, with an active retail presence in 20 countries, delivering ebooks to another 170. And as some countries slow down, other ones begin to accelerate, allowing us to continue to see double-digit growth even 7 years in, as other retailers who focused solely on the US are flat or going in reverse. The third thing that we did was We embraced our Canadianness both to succeed in Canada, but also as a complement to our international success. It turns out that being Canadian has helped us in a surprising number of ways, in a surprising number of places. For example, publishers and retailers in France are notoriously cautious about working with foreign retailers, especially in relation to ebooks, but our membership in La Francophonie and our sensitivity to France's tradition of cultural protection got us a partnership with France's largest retailer, Fnac, and has allowed us to build a significant French business thereafter. Our history as a Commonwealth country who had forged its own distinct English literature helped us with our partnerships in Australia and New Zealand. In Belgium and Switzerland, we understood that the complexities of multilingual politics with all of its richness and complexity. In Mexico, we shared with both publishers and retailers the struggle to fight to keep a distinct national culture while living right next to a neighbor who casts a very long cultural shadow. Stories like this were repeated from the UK to Netherlands, from Turkey to Brazil. They allowed us to form alliances and partnerships that our competitors could not. And everywhere, being Canadian meant that we were comfortable with the idea that books were more than just things to be sold, more than just units or content. They are containers of a country's dreaming, its stories and arguments and history, its most dangerous suggestions and most serious thought. Books live at that intersection between culture and commerce, with business and policymakers and consumers all crossing paths, a source of pride and heritage and identity which we as Canadians are entirely familiar. I've talked mostly about Kobo as an international business. In doing so, I haven't talked about our beautiful devices, our innovations in software, our big data-driven research into reading behavior and predictive analytics, the fact that this is the first major digital revolution that isn't being driven by men 18 to 25, but is instead being powered by women who are 50 years and older who love reading. Each of those is worth 5 minutes on its own, but I'll close by bringing us back to this theme of disruption. When we first started to get some traction, there was a fairly strong narrative that ebooks and apps and e-readers and self-publishing were part of a digital wave that was going to wash away bookstores and publishers. And it's not the first time that that warning has been given. 10 years before that, it was e-commerce. Before that, it was big box retail. Except that miraculously enough, it turns out that in each case, what looked like a disruptor may have been something else, a spark or a catalyst. We always believed that ebooks particularly were a revolution that could happen with authors and publishers and retailers, rather than a revolution that would have to happen to them. This industry has adapted and evolved, unlike music and movies, has been able to do so without catastrophe. Bookstores focused on community and service and attractive physical spaces. Publishers made paper books more beautiful and more collectible while developing digital skills at the same time. Even Indigo took the dividends from its sale of Kobo to reshape itself as a cultural department store with books surrounded by lifestyle merchandise for adults and for children, and a few shelves for Kobo along the way. And we keep innovating as we try to move that 1 in 5 books to 1 in 4 and beyond. As a country, we know a thing or two about quiet revolutions. And this time, we know how to export them as well. Thank you.
You spoke initially about where this all originated, which was a company funding an effort to disrupt itself. So I wanted to hear a little bit more on that, because that is notoriously difficult, because if a company is doing well, is successful, it's very reluctant to fund something that will eat into its current revenues. So can you talk just briefly about the pushback that you had there and how you overcame that and created a sort of a culture of disruption?
It was a fascinating discussion at Indigo, where they had, I would say, a very clear sense that there was a choice of doing them themselves, or that someone would come in and wouldn't just sell ebooks to their customers, but those customers would actually go away entirely. That you don't just lose someone for one medium, you lose the relationship, and at that point, the customer itself. And that's a conversation that we've now had country by country and retailer by retailer all over the world. And it's fascinating to watch people go through, kind of the 7 stages of digital denial and land in a place where they go, okay, so either we're going to do it or someone else will do it. And it's remarkable to watch retailers on a national basis kind of rise to the defense of their own culture and decide, no, it should be us. We're the people that know this country best. We're the people that know these authors best. We want it to be us who's helping to communicate those stories both digitally and in print. It's been fascinating to see.
Right, and one final quick question for you then. You talked about going country by country. Your initial premise was to focus on the domestic market, but you've now since been quite successful internationally. Can you tell us what brand Canada is? Because you said it's an advantage. What do people abroad think of Canada when they see a Canadian company?
There is a combination of cultural sensitivity, a sense that we treat culture as more than commerce here, and that's something that resonates very well as you move into other markets. We're certainly a place where technology innovation comes from. There's an understanding that the quality of the service and the products that we put out are going to be good. But there's also a fundamental sense of collaboration, that we're looking at creating relationships with other markets and with other retailers that truly are mutually beneficial. We're not coming in to try and run the table. We're not trying to draw customers away from those retailers who are already there. We're trying to do this with them. And there's a place where being from Canada as opposed to some other markets helps us a lot with that.
Right. And then final, because I'm going to squeeze one more in. You sort of talked about the success that you've had across all of these markets. What advice have you got to people operating in different markets? So maybe not in your industry, maybe not in the countries that you operate in, but what can you do to instigate this culture of disruption? For any advice for Canadian companies out there?
I think the biggest one for us was, as I said before, at the very beginning, we believed that this was international. So we didn't think, okay, we'll do Canada. Oh, this is going well. Now let's try to go some other places. From essentially the first line of code from the first business plan that was written, it's this only survives, this only grows if we break out of this market and get into other ones as quickly as possible. That allows us to do better in Canada. That allows us to then draw revenue and resources and scale in so that we can compete even better here. But it only works if we have that scale across multiple markets, and it was baked into the DNA when we began.
Great. Okay, well, Michael, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Tamblyn.
Thanks so much for having me.